What if the most dangerous shift in global power isn't announced through headlines or breaking news alerts, but instead moves silently beneath everything people think they understand about alliances, enemies, and stability? Because the truth is, the world rarely changes in obvious ways. It changes quietly, gradually, through signals most people ignore until it's too late to interpret them correctly. And right now, beneath the noise of daily politics, beneath the endless debates about conflicts that seem urgent but temporary, a deeper transformation is taking place, one that doesn't begin with weapons, but with perception. Because before any confrontation becomes visible, it is first constructed in the minds of decision makers, strategists, and institutions that operate far away from public attention. And once that construction reaches a certain point, events don't just happen randomly anymore, they begin to follow a direction. Almost like a script that was written long before anyone realized they were part of it. Now consider this carefully, because it changes how you see everything that follows. Every major geopolitical conflict in modern history has followed a pattern, not identical in details, but identical in structure. First comes the identification of tension, then the amplification of that tension, followed by the normalization of hostility, and finally the justification of action. And what makes this process so effective is that each stage feels independent when you're living through it. People believe they are reacting to events in real time, when in reality, those events are often the result of something much more deliberate unfolding behind the scenes. This is why most people only recognize a conflict when it reaches its final stage, when it becomes impossible to ignore. But by then, the outcome is already shaped, the possibilities already narrowed, the decisions already influenced by everything that came before. So the real question isn't whether a conflict will happen. The real question is whether the early stages of that conflict are already underway without being fully recognized. And if they are, then what we're witnessing right now isn't the beginning of something new, but the continuation of something that has been building quietly for a long time. Because patterns don't emerge suddenly. They reveal themselves slowly through repetition, through consistency, through signals that only make sense when you step back and connect them. And once you do that, once you begin to see how separate events align into a larger sequence, it becomes much harder to dismiss them as coincidence. Think about how narratives evolve. At first, a statement appears, something subtle, something that doesn't immediately trigger alarm. Then that statement is repeated, not exactly the same way, but with slight variations across different platforms by different voices. Over time, the repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates acceptance. Eventually, what once sounded like speculation begins to feel like common sense. And that's the turning point, because once a narrative becomes accepted, it no longer needs to be proven. It becomes the lens through which future events are interpreted. This is how perception is shaped, not through force, but through consistency. And right now, if you pay close attention, you can see this process happening again. Not loudly, not aggressively, but steadily. Conversations that once focused on one set of dynamics are beginning to shift toward another. Language that was once neutral is becoming more defined, more directional. Analysts who previously concentrated on one region are gradually redirecting their attention elsewhere. None of this feels dramatic in isolation. But together, it forms a trajectory. And trajectories matter because they indicate where things are likely to go, even if the final destination hasn't been openly acknowledged yet. What makes this situation different, however, is the speed at which these shifts are occurring. Historically, these kinds of transitions took years, sometimes decades, to fully develop. But today, the pace is accelerating. Information moves faster, narratives spread wider, and reactions happen almost instantly. This compression of time means that patterns which once unfolded slowly are now progressing much more rapidly. And that creates a unique kind of risk because it reduces the window in which those patterns can be recognized and understood before they reach a critical point. At the same time, there's another layer to consider, one that often goes unnoticed: systems. Not individual decisions, not isolated actions, but systems that operate continuously, regardless of who is in charge or what specific events are taking place. These systems are built over time, reinforced through policies, relationships, and incentives that make them self-sustaining. And once a system reaches a certain level of complexity, it doesn't simply stop. It adapts, it evolves, it finds new directions to maintain its momentum. This is important because it means that even if circumstances change, the underlying drive of the system remains. So when you look at the current global landscape, you have to ask yourself, what systems are in motion right now, and what do they require to keep functioning? Because the answer to that question often reveals more than any single event ever could. Systems need inputs. They need conditions that justify their existence, that sustain their relevance, that allow them to continue operating at full capacity. And when those conditions begin to fade, the system doesn't just shut down, it adjusts, it seeks alternatives, it creates new pathways to maintain itself. This is where things start to become more complex, because it means that conflicts are not always purely reactive. Sometimes they are the result of systems reaching a point where continuation requires change, not necessarily intentional in the way people usually think about it, but structural, almost inevitable. And when you combine that with rapidly shifting narratives and accelerating timelines, you get a situation where the early stages of a major transformation can unfold right in front of everyone without being fully understood. Now, here's the part that most people miss. Awareness doesn't always prevent outcomes. In fact, sometimes awareness comes too late when the process has already advanced beyond the point where it can be easily redirected. But there's a difference between awareness and recognition. Awareness is knowing that something is happening. Recognition is understanding what that something actually means. And right now, there's a growing gap between those two things. People are aware that tensions are shifting, that relationships are changing, that new dynamics are emerging. But recognition, the deeper understanding of how those changes fit together, is still limited. And that gap creates uncertainty. Because when you can't fully interpret what you're seeing, it becomes much harder to anticipate what comes next. Events start to feel unpredictable even when they are following a pattern. Reactions become reactive instead of strategic. And that's exactly the kind of environment where larger shifts can take place without immediate resistance. But patterns, once seen, don't disappear. They become clearer. Each new development either reinforces them or challenges them. And the more consistent the pattern becomes, the more difficult it is to ignore. That's why it's important to focus not just on what is happening, but on how it is happening. The sequence, the timing, the repetition, these are the elements that reveal whether something is random or structured. Right now, if you map recent developments against this framework, a sequence begins to emerge. Not perfectly aligned, not identical in every detail, but close enough to raise serious questions. Because when multiple elements start moving in the same direction at the same time, it suggests coordination at some level, even if that coordination isn't openly acknowledged. And when that happens, the likelihood of those movements leading toward a specific outcome increases significantly. At the same time, there's an important distinction to keep in mind. Patterns don't guarantee outcomes. They indicate probabilities. They show direction, not certainty. But in complex systems, direction often matters more than individual events. Because once a system is moving in a particular direction, changing that direction becomes increasingly difficult over time. It requires significant effort, significant disruption, or significant resistance. And those things don't always appear when they are needed. So the real tension isn't just between different countries or different policies, it's between momentum and resistance. Momentum pushes things forward along the path that has already been established. Resistance attempts to slow that movement, redirect it, or stop it entirely. And the outcome depends on which force is stronger at any given moment. Right now, momentum appears to be building, not in a way that is immediately visible to everyone, but in a way that becomes clearer when you step back and look at the broader picture. Signals are aligning, narratives are evolving, systems are adjusting, and all of these elements are interacting with each other in ways that suggest something larger is taking shape. But here's where it gets even more complicated, because unlike previous situations, the current environment is far more interconnected. Actions in one area don't stay contained, they ripple outward, affecting multiple regions, multiple systems, multiple layers of interaction. This interconnectedness amplifies both the impact of decisions and the consequences of miscalculations. It means that even small shifts can have disproportionate effects, especially when they occur within an already evolving pattern. And that brings us to a critical point, the role of anticipation. Not prediction in the sense of claiming certainty, but anticipation in the sense of understanding possibilities. Because once you recognize a pattern, you can begin to explore where it might lead, what scenarios it might produce, what outcomes it makes more likely. And that doesn't just change how you interpret current events, it changes how you prepare for future ones. But anticipation also comes with its own challenge. It requires looking beyond immediate reactions, beyond surface level explanations, beyond the narratives that dominate public discourse. It requires asking uncomfortable questions, considering alternative perspectives, and acknowledging uncertainties that don't have easy answers. And that's not something most people are naturally inclined to do, especially in an environment where information is constant, fast-moving, and often fragmented. Still, the importance of doing so becomes clear when you consider what's at stake. Because if the pattern continues, if the momentum persists, if the systems remain aligned in their current direction, then the next phase won't simply be an extension of what has already happened. It will be something more significant, more complex, and potentially more disruptive than anything that came before. And that's the cliffhanger most people aren't prepared for, because the real shift doesn't happen when the final step occurs. And it happens when the system reaches a point where that final step becomes possible. And if that point is approaching, then what we're seeing right now isn't just a series of isolated developments. It's the lead up to something that has been quietly forming piece by piece out of view. The moment you begin to separate noise from structure, a different picture starts to emerge, one that doesn't rely on dramatic headlines or sudden escalations, but instead reveals itself through alignment. Because alignment is what transforms scattered events into a coherent direction. And right now, multiple layers of global interaction are beginning to align in a way that is difficult to dismiss once you recognize it. Not perfectly synchronized, not officially coordinated, but moving just close enough to suggest that something deeper is guiding the flow. And this is where the situation becomes far more complex than most surface-level analysis can capture. Because the world is not operating on a single timeline anymore. There are multiple timelines unfolding simultaneously: political, economic, military, informational, and each one moves at its own speed. Sometimes they intersect, sometimes they diverge, but when they begin to converge even briefly, the impact becomes magnified. That convergence creates moments where decisions carry more weight, where actions trigger wider consequences, where outcomes become harder to control once they are set in motion. And if you look closely, you'll notice that we are entering one of those moments now. Start with perception shifts, because they are always the earliest indicators. Not the loud statements, but the subtle changes in framing. The way discussions evolve, the way priorities shift, the way certain topics begin to receive more attention while others fade into the background. This doesn't happen randomly. It reflects a gradual redirection of focus, one that often precedes more tangible developments. And when that redirection becomes consistent across different platforms, different regions, different perspectives, it suggests that something is being redefined at a foundational level. At the same time, there is a parallel process happening within institutional thinking. Organizations, alliances, and strategic bodies don't react as quickly as individuals, but when they do adjust, their changes tend to be more enduring. Policies are reconsidered, frameworks are reevaluated, long-standing assumptions are quietly tested against new realities. None of this is announced in a way that captures public attention, but it shapes the environment in which future decisions will be made. And once those internal adjustments reach a certain threshold, they begin to influence external behavior in ways that seem sudden, even though they have been building internally for a long time. Now combine that with technological acceleration. Information no longer moves in predictable patterns. It spreads instantly, reshapes itself, and influences perception at a scale that was not possible in previous decades. This creates a feedback loop where narratives don't just evolve, they amplify. A single idea can be reinforced, challenged, modified, and redistributed within hours, reaching audiences that interpret it in completely different ways. And that diversity of interpretation adds another layer of complexity, because it means that the same event can produce multiple realities depending on how it is framed and consumed. But here's the critical part. Amid all this complexity, certain signals remain consistent. They cut through the noise because they are repeated, reinforced, and aligned with broader movements. These signals don't rely on dramatic presentation. They gain strength through persistence. And when you identify them, you begin to see how they connect seemingly unrelated developments into a larger sequence. One of those signals is the gradual tightening of strategic positioning. Not overt, not aggressive, but deliberate. Movements that bring actors closer to key areas of influence, closer to critical zones of interaction, closer to points where their interests intersect with others. This kind of positioning doesn't trigger immediate reactions because it often appears defensive or routine, but over time, it creates a landscape where interactions become inevitable. And once interactions become inevitable, the potential for escalation increases, even if that escalation is not the intended outcome. Another signal is the recalibration of alliances. Not necessarily the formation of entirely new partnerships, but the adjustment of existing ones. Relationships that were once stable begin to show signs of strain. Others that were previously limited start to deepen. Communication channels shift, priorities change, and while none of these adjustments seem decisive on their own, together they alter the balance of alignment. They redefine who supports whom, who trusts whom, and who is willing to act under certain conditions. At the same time, economic interactions are undergoing their own transformation. Trade routes, resource dependencies, financial flows, all of these elements are being subtly reconfigured, not in a way that disrupts the global system immediately, but in a way that introduces new vulnerabilities and new leverage points. Because economics is not just about growth or stability, it's about influence, the ability to shape outcomes without direct confrontation. And when economic structures begin to shift, they create pressure that can either stabilize or destabilize the broader system, depending on how it is applied. Now layer on top of that the concept of strategic patience. Not everything is meant to happen quickly. In fact, some of the most significant shifts occur precisely because they are allowed to develop over time. Patience creates space for patterns to solidify, for positions to strengthen, for options to expand. It reduces the risk of premature action while increasing the potential impact of eventual decisions. And when multiple actors adopt this approach simultaneously, the result is a kind of silent buildup, one that doesn't attract immediate attention, but becomes increasingly significant as it progresses. But patience has limits. Eventually, conditions reach a point where waiting no longer provides an advantage, where the cost of inaction begins to outweigh the risks of movement. And identifying that moment is one of the most difficult challenges in strategic thinking. Move too early and you expose yourself unnecessarily. Move too late and you lose the initiative. The timing has to align with both internal readiness and external conditions. And when it does, the transition from preparation to action can happen very quickly. This is where uncertainty begins to intensify, because from the outside, it's not always clear when that transition point has been reached. Indicators may exist, but they are often ambiguous, open to interpretation, influenced by incomplete information, and that ambiguity creates space for miscalculation. Actors may interpret signals differently, respond in ways that were not anticipated, escalate situations that could have remained stable, and once that process starts, controlling it becomes increasingly difficult. Another layer to consider is the role of indirect influence. Not everything that shapes outcomes is visible. There are channels of communication, networks of coordination, and forms of interaction that operate beyond public awareness. These elements don't replace official actions, but they complement them. They provide flexibility, deniability, and the ability to test responses without committing to full-scale decisions. And when used effectively, they can shape the environment in subtle but powerful ways. At the same time, there is a question of resilience. Not just the ability to withstand pressure, but the ability to adapt to it. Systems that are rigid tend to break under stress. Systems that are flexible can absorb shocks and continue functioning. And in a rapidly changing environment, resilience becomes one of the most important factors in determining outcomes, because it allows actors to adjust their strategies in real time, to respond to unexpected developments, to maintain stability even when conditions become volatile.